Hello, and welcome to Ask Tell number 13. I'm Adam Kadri. So, between installment number 11 and number 12, 1,785 days elapsed. Between number 12 and number 13, it was 18 days. At this rate of improvement, number 14 should come out in about 3.5 hours. That will not be happening. But we can worry about number 14 later. For now, let's get on with lucky number 13. First up, we have Floatpoint by an author who writes under the name Emily Short. We've done a couple of her early games on this show already, back in episodes 1 and 3. These days, 20 plus years after those games came out, she is, as I understand it at least, pretty much universally acclaimed as the single leading figure in interactive fiction. And to think I knew her when. The IF community was small back in the late 90s and early 2000s, but it was still large enough that, there were people like John Ingold and Sam Barlow who I'd occasionally exchange messages with. But then there were people I hung out with online for hours every single day. And Emily was one of those. And you know her personally as well, right?
Yeah, just through having coffee or lunch once or twice. Nothing deeper than that. And of course, admiring the hell out of her work from afar for the most part and learning most of what I know about interactive narrative from reading her blog is about the extent of it.
And that is the voice of my guest for this segment, Jess Haskins, who's been a regular on this show since episode 1. But thanks to the long hiatus, that means we haven't heard from her since 2017. So perhaps a reintroduction is in order.
I'm Jess Haskins. I'm an editor and narrative designer. I used to put narrative designer first, but I've gotten to making editing enough of my work that that's made it to the top spot. I freelance through the game editors. Our tagline is, the game editors get your game edited. Not subliminal messaging at all. I think that games benefit from being edited the way you would novels or other literary works because they are. I also do some world building and narrative and story consulting. A few projects that I've worked on are our own point-and-click adventure game, Rosewater, steampunk Western adventure that's coming out later this year that I'm a co-writer on. And I teach at the NYU Game Center now, advising student teams on their projects, which is kind of an interesting parallel to the kind of advising that I do on professional indie projects.
Right on. So here we have Floatpoint, which won the 2006 Interactive Fiction Competition. It also won the Zizzy Awards that year for Best Setting and Best Non-Player Characters, aka NPCs. What's it about?
You basically play an ambassador who is traveling to the Aleheart colony, where these descendants from Earth have established a colony, lost contact, and you're there on a diplomatic mission of unclear parameters. It's kind of interesting how little you know about what's going on or what you're supposed to do, which is an interesting way of pulling the player into it. But you just know that you have a job somehow of bringing these colonists back to Earth because of an impending climate disaster that's going to render their planet uninhabitable. It's a pretty tight, compact game. You have a list of tasks to do and an advisor to help you and sort of various instructions from high command, various things nudging you along to collect items and learn information and prepare for this diplomatic ritual of gift giving that has significance that you need to glean and figure out as you go. And it basically leads you to a major decision point at the end when you've gathered all of the items and hopefully information you need, and then basically get to decide how to carry out that ritual in a way that will produce a wide variety of endings and see what the resolution of this diplomatic overture will be.
All right. So, the idea behind this show is that I used to be heavily involved in the world of interactive fiction, but then I lost track of it, and now I'm trying to get at least slightly less lost. Prior to starting this show, the last batch of games I had played had been from 2001. But I was actually still socially involved with the IF world as late as 2006. So even though I didn't play Floatpoint when it came out, I knew what Emily was talking about around that time when it came to pushing the frontiers of the medium. And so I know that one of her interests was expanding the audience for IF beyond the 200 or so people who had bought all the Infocom games back in the 80s and were playing what the hobbyist community was now coming up with. You know, last episode I was talking with a new guest, Phoebe, who didn't start playing IF until well into the 21st century. But nevertheless, the game she was shown by someone trying to get her into the medium was Zork. So I think that around 2006, Emily was asking, all right, 30 years after Zork, can we try to put out some games that might be a little friendlier to newcomers? So we see some of her ideas here in Floatpoint. There's a novice mode that will suggest some commands that'll work, which turns the game into more of a choose-your-own-adventure. There's no need to laboriously traverse the map by going north, north, west, southeast. You still can if you want to, but you can also just go directly to places. You can also go directly to objects. So if you're like, oh yeah, I need that box, you can just type go to the box, and it'll take you to where you last saw the box, which is awesome. And you mentioned the list of tasks you have to get through, which the game updates for you as you go along, and that's another one of these features. No need for you to take notes on what you need to accomplish because you can just type think, and the game will say, rightio, here's your to-do list. Now, maybe in 2023, these are things that people just take for granted. I honestly have no idea. But as an unfrozen caveman IF player for whom 2006 is the state of the art, I was really impressed.
Well, the first time I played this, it starts off with a prompt that says, have you played interactive fiction before? And I said, yes. I was like, oh, that's nice. And I got on with it. So the second time I played, I said no, just to see what these player-friendly features were. And I was really impressed by the richness. I'm like, oh, this is an entire discussion of and introduction of IF on top of this game, plus a tutorial or assist mode for every single thing that you do. And like, that's almost as much work as the game itself. There's this whole like little menu system where you can read about different topics, like dealing with NPCs, navigating, working with inventory. And then also there's another whole menu with topics about specific hints for certain puzzles, and the whole progressive hint system where, you know, if you keep pressing H, it goes from vaguer to more precise to just telling you the list of commands to solve basically the 3 obstacles. I don't think you would even really consider them puzzles. You know, like on IFDB, some of the comments were like, oh, there weren't really any puzzles. And there's certain people who really hang their hat on that. An IF game is a puzzle and it's how well you do the puzzles, but that's not what I'm here for. So it was sort of the perfect level for me. But the few like little multi-step obstacles that, you know, you need to do to accomplish your main tasks, it'll walk you through those. So I was really impressed by the way that that was put together, but also if you just say like, yes, I've played IF before, I don't need the help, then it's also completely invisible and you just get on with it and it's fine. Although I do kind of wish that I'd known about features like go to any room or go to any object, which seems like an extra level of amenity that I wouldn't have expected. I don't know. I don't play a lot of modern IF either. I also play stuff mostly from around this like early aughts period, I think. So I don't expect those really nice features. I think to me, the change that I'm more apt to notice is the shift away from obscure puzzles to just interactive stories that you move through. And this seems to be taking part in that shift too.
I'm not a puzzle person either, but I'd actually go broader than that. I loved writing IF, but I've rarely enjoyed playing it. Because, I don't know, most of the time I start up a game and type in a few commands, and then I hit some minor obstacles and I just sort of sigh. Because I'm usually not in the mood to grind my way to a solution. Exhaustion just sets in really early for me, and so I either turn to a walkthrough or else I just give up. And with Floatpoint, that didn't happen. I actually enjoyed being in this world and poking around and examining the scenery and ticking items off my task list. And yet it didn't feel like I was just clicking my way through the story, where the commands are basically just turning pages. I did feel like I was doing stuff. Just somehow it didn't deplete my reserves the way that IF tends to do. So I thought the game hit a really nice balance, for me at least.
Yeah, well, you are solving a puzzle. It's solving a puzzle in your mind rather than in the game system of what the heck is going on here and what do all these things mean and how do these cryptic flashbacks fit into what's happening now, or, what did that side comment mean? What are the interpersonal relationships at play here, which is also a kind of puzzle and problem solving, but you don't need to prove to the game that you've done it. You can just stick whatever in the box and throw it at Liam and see what happens. But it's not just clicking through and seeing what happens. You do have to expend the mental energy of making it all make sense, which is the form of interactive narrative and kind of literary form of problem solving that I enjoy, similar to a detective mystery or something where, you can just keep turning the page, or you can be thinking really deeply about the clues and trying to piece it together in your head alongside the story that's unfolding.
Yeah, let's get into that for a minute. Last segment we covered a game called the Elysium Enigma, and the guest for that segment, Kat, pointed out that a title like that suggests that there's going to be an enigma, and that the enigma is the world of Elysium itself. And it sounds to me like you're proposing here that Aleheart is the puzzle, building a clear enough picture of this alien society that you know how to behave, and ultimately can make a decision about what you want to communicate at the gift ceremony. And that in turn brings us to the world building here, which is another one of the game's strong points. One thing I liked about the world building here is that so much of it is extra, by which I mean that we learn a lot of things about Aleheart that aren't just of instrumental value. For instance, one of the things we learn about this society is that the colonists are disgusted by food. The same way that in our society, most of us are disgusted by bathroom functions. Like, we recognize that they're physiologically necessary, but they're not subjects for polite conversation, and are certainly not to be performed in public. So on Aleheart, if you take your ration bar out of your quarters and the colonists see you holding food in public, they will go talk, 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 talk at you, which is their way of scolding people. And that's super interesting and funny, but it's not necessary. Unless I miss something, you never leverage their disgust with food to solve a puzzle. It's just to make the world more interesting. And I am a huge fan of putting interesting things into stories purely for the sake of having a story with more interesting things in it. But since you've mentioned that world building is your stock in trade these days, any thoughts on that element of Floatpoint?
Yeah, it's very well done, and this place seems sort of coherent and believable and feels interesting.
Well, since we're both agreed on that, and maybe that doesn't give us a lot to talk about, let me turn that around. What is this a contrast to? When you encounter bad world building in something you're editing, how do you recognize it and how do you fix it?
It's not usually something that I would fix directly, but at a sort of early stage of consultation with a client or helping them think through the world building, I think the biggest pitfalls that I see a lot are unintentionally reproducing all of the tropes and ideas of all your favorite media that you've been exposed to. Oh, this is a killer robots with lasers stomping on cities story. It's one of those. Or, it's cyberpunk. So everything's neon and everyone eats Chinese food in the streets while it rains. Kind of like taking an idea and then taking along the whole package without thinking about what those elements do in the setting or why the progenitors of those tropes might have combined those things in that way and they were new at the time. We actually just finished reading Neuromancer for our book club. So that one is kind of front of mind, where you read it and you get the sense like, oh, yeah, this is so cyberpunky. It's all the tropes. Yeah, but he invented them. Like, no one had put those things together before. So I tend to be a proponent of remixing things, or like taking two different elements that don't usually occur together and putting them together in an intentional way, and then basically seeing what happens. Like, what would the consequences be if you had this spacefaring civilization, but also fire breathing dragons? And just thinking about, like, well, how will dragons live in space? What kind of suits do they need? Does fire breathing work in vacuum? But a lot of it is just throwing too many things in because they're cool. But if you take one thing and then think, what would actually happen if this were true? Like, this is the regular modern day world, but everyone's telepathic. Well, that's going to have a whole lot of effects, so much that if you work your way through them, it's not really going to resemble the modern, like, present day world that much. I think Emily mentioned really thinking about what would this divergent culture that really has these collective beliefs and survival above individual rights, and how are some ways that might manifest in their culture? What would be the conflicts when they come back in contact with individualistic human rights respecting humans? And I think those things are explored pretty interestingly and have been thought through carefully, you can kind of tell.
Well, I definitely agree with the idea that a good story should weave together at least two disparate premises. So much so that I put it on my list of patterns on my website. It's pattern 38. And one book that inspired me to add that pattern to the list was The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin. Part of the premise is, what if you have a society in which people are sexless the vast majority of the time? But then every month they spend a few days having morphed into either a male or a female, and they never know which it's going to be any given month until it happens. And then another part of the premise is, what if you had a society living on a slush ball planet where the climate near the equator is similar to Alaska and everywhere else it's like Antarctica? What would a society on that kind of slush ball planet really look like? And Ursula K. Le Guin was like, all right, let's make these the same planet. And that made the story an order of magnitude richer, because it means that the premise isn't just one-dimensional. And I gotta say, most of my own IF is based on that same idea of weaving things together. Like with Endless Nameless. Part of that game is based on taking the ideas that Alan Moore used in his run on the comic book Supreme and applying them to interactive fiction. And then part of it is based on a vacation to Cape Cod that I took with a circle of my IF friends, Emily included. And I thought, a game that's just about genre conventions, or a game that's just a sort of autobiographical slice of life, would be pretty thin gruel, but make a game that's both simultaneously, and now maybe it comes to life. Or an example from quite a bit earlier. Part of Varicella was just wanting to do something with Machiavellian intrigue. And part of it was based on the idea of a game world getting steadily swallowed up by this green glob. And I think putting those disparate elements into the same game makes them work a lot better than using them on their own.
Yeah, definitely. And that's how we get new stuff. It's like, I've never seen these things done before, rather than, oh, this is a cyberpunk story, but this one's pretty good. Yeah, when you get very successful, then you get imitators. And now you can't think of living on a slush ball without also changing genders.
But to circle back around to the second half of what you were saying, I mentioned that circa 2006, Emily was trying to explore ways to make IF friendlier to newcomers. But as I recall, her primary concern was exploring how IF could go beyond early text adventure puzzle solving. Because when I first got into IF in the late 90s, that's what the vast majority of games still revolved around. Like, you wanted to get into a room, but the door was locked, and so to unlock it, you had to solve a Towers of Hanoi puzzle or something. Or you're in a spaceship, and it's about to crash, and you have to fix the engine. And logically enough, the community that arose around these games liked them. And so when new people like me and like Emily would show up and say, hey, what if we ditched the puzzles and tried something new? These fans would say, but without puzzles, where's the interactivity? Aren't you just going to be putting readers on a tour bus and driving them through your short story? And these days, my answer to how you get interactivity without puzzles is largely offering up a big narrative space to explore through combinations. There's always the risk of combinatorial explosion, but controlled explosions are where the fun is. But I remember Emily writing about how she wanted to use interactivity to present players with real ethical choices. And that's what we have here. The player character, David, has a real moral dilemma, or maybe more of a trilemma, because his basic choices are not just to either leave the colonists to fend for themselves or bring them back to Earth, but also, if he does bring them back to Earth, will it be as equals, or will they be subjects? Now, at first glance, that might not seem like much of a moral quandary. It seems like there's a pretty clear hierarchy with the evil decision and the good decision and the wishy-washy decision. But Emily does a couple of things to make it a more complex decision than it sounds. First, I seem to remember her writing something along the lines of, it's easy to embrace multiculturalism when the other culture just wears different hats than you do, but that things get trickier when the other culture has values that you find abhorrent. So we learn that these colonists left Earth in the first place in order to practice untrammeled genetic engineering, meaning both that they create living monstrosities and that they practice eugenics, including culls of segments of the population. And presumably much of the audience for this game would find this pretty objectionable.
Yeah, that was definitely interesting. There's that one ending where, you see it's like, oh, good, you're going to take us to Earth. Well, let us just parade past your window all of the people whose genetic lines are now unfit and will be culled. And it's just this dark, well, here's what you chose.
Yep. And then a second thing Emily does to make the choice less clear-cut is to give us no fewer than 5 different characters all backing different positions on the central question here. You have Kruger from High Command, and Valenti, the rebellious ambassador, and Pamela from the crew of your ship, and your best friend Jane, and your colonist aide Liam, and you cannot make all of them happy. You may not even be able to keep all of them alive.
Yeah, the idea of the ethical choice, not the ethical, the moral choice has been something of a punchline in games in general. Save the orphans or burn down the orphanage, moral choice. And, if you save some orphans and burn down others, then it all balances out and you're just neutral. That, of course, is a model that was popular for a while and has become more critiqued. But I think maybe sort of replaced by the faction alliance thing, which is sort of what you were getting at, that, there's different people in the world that want different things and you decide which one to throw your hat in with. And I don't know, in certain games, maybe that means exterminate all the others. But a lot of times that ends up being, do you want to join the orphan saving faction or the orphan burning faction? And can't amount to the same thing, or they're both horrible, kill all of the orphan savers and burners third faction. That's just the wild card. But if you want to actually make something that involves ethical choices and moral reasoning and resembles a bit more how the world actually works, then what you do is you have 2 very noble and honorable values and you put them in conflict and then decide situationally or maybe based on your belief in the absolute importance of these values or your own personal background or relationships. Maybe you want to appeal to the person who holds one value over another. For instance, the kind of common one and one that comes into place here is the conflict of the values of individualism and individual human rights versus collectivism and the common good. Do you compromise the rights of the individual in order to save more people? So needs of the many, needs of the few, classic moral choice, which is certainly in play here. I think the most interesting games try and set up their ethical conflicts that way and have someone in the world who is sort of the mouthpiece for that value or for a particular stance, and embrace this idea that you can't just do the right thing that will please everyone and work out the best and make everyone happy, that someone is going to be upset or someone's needs aren't going to be met. So in that case, it's about what do you personally value, which is much more interesting. And that's certainly what was going on in this game.
All right, I have a couple of things to say about that. You mentioned factions, and being the age I am and being out of touch with 21st century games as I am, my mind immediately goes to the game Alpha Centauri, in which you have 7 factions, each with its own set of ideological priorities, but it seems like a loaded choice. It's like, do you want to be the environmentalists who live in harmony with each other and with the planet? Or do you want to be the Christian fundamentalists? Or the pave the world money-hungry hedonists? Or the shoot everybody and sort it out later military nuts? And it's like, obviously the environmentalists are the good ones. Who would ever play one of those other factions? Except, out here in the real world, there are plenty of Christian fundamentalists. And plenty of people who just want to get rich and buy a yacht. And plenty of trigger-happy paranoiacs stockpiling assault rifles. These factions seem gross to me, but maybe a lot of players would have been just as averse to playing as the Daughters of Gaia. And the second thing is this. You mentioned in your introduction to the game that this story culminates in a gift-giving ritual, and we've been talking about how that doubles as a policy decision. And you make that decision through the power of combinations. For those who haven't played this, the way that it works is that you have to choose a gift. So far as I can tell, there are 5 objects in the game that fit into the gift box, but 2 of them are just different types of blades and the endings treat them the same, so you basically have 4 choices. And you have to choose what to wear. That's very important. There are 3 different colors that signify different proposed relationships. So I found 13 endings. Those 12 combinations of 3 colors times 4 objects, plus a trivial ending if you don't select a color and just confuse everyone. And the substance of the game is collecting the garments and the gifts so that you have all the possible combinations available, and then you select one right at the end. So what did you think of this structure?
I like that basically all of it is just gathering items and information until you get to that one decision point. And then it's very easy to save right at the end and then try them all out. I really liked that. And that's certainly a good way of delaying the branching of so that you don't have that combinatorial explosion until the very end. This game is one long trail with nothing that counts as branches, maybe just different slightly winding paths or circling around until you get to that point, and then a fan of endings at the end. And I liked how each one of the endings is all sort of in equal status. Like there's no one best winning ending. It's really just to what degree you feel good or bad about or agree with how things turned out. So you get basically just the quick reaction of the ambassador to your gift, whether it's what she expected or whether she's confused or looks upset. And then it sort of cuts to a coda of, sometime later. And it's usually some conversation scene with someone just sort of discussing how things went and sort of talking about the long-term political repercussions of the choice that you made and how different people feel about what you chose. And every one of them felt valid and earned, even the darkest. If you wear black and give a knife, then that's sort of like the darkest, nastiest, like we won't help you and, we don't care if you live or die ending. And the player character will defend that choice afterward and sort of explain what he was thinking. Maybe it's not quite the same as what you were thinking, but sort of give even that valid reasons for picking that or make that just as acceptable an outcome as the others.
Yeah, it sounds like I'm a little more skeptical about the structure. Because I think a lot of players have the mindset that you haven't finished the game until you've seen everything there is to see. And so when they get to the end of this one, they're not going to be thinking, okay, which combination do I truly believe to be the most ethical choice? They're just going to mechanically crank through every combination. I mean, that's what I did. So if you really want players to make an ethical choice, I think maybe you have to have a branching plot. And maybe you have to make players commit to a branch early. If every decision means an investment of hours, maybe people think it through a little bit more than they otherwise would. So I think that if I had to level a criticism at Floatpoint, that might be it. So how about you? Did you see any weak links here?
Yeah, it seems like this game is maybe over-engineered and more complex with more systems than it needs. I felt this way about the time. Time only mattered in one moment when you got a message and something was happening in 15 minutes. And I don't even know how tight that was. I never had a playthrough where I missed that rendezvous or something. But other than that, I didn't need to know what time it was, so it seemed like that could have been left off. And the other one was stats. You have this device that informs you when your messages are there and lets you summon your aid and also gives you a readout of, I don't know if they were ever spelled out in full, but I took it to be sociability or maybe social standing, power, and intelligence, and more specifically as perceived by the people around you. In the second playthrough, I also found some more stuff in the database from Valenti's logs about him getting this device. And it was a gift that he got from the ambassador Aileen. And it has that engraving on it to him from her, if you know how to interpret the engraving. And there's a little bit of background technobabble about how, like, wow, this thing can tell you down to the number how you're perceived socially or how your power ranking is. And it has like a kind of like brain that's like the brains of these aliens, and it can read it out. Man, you could get addicted to that kind of fine-grained information. He even speculates like a player would, like, man, what would happen if I just ran bare-assed through the sanctum and, ruined my intelligence score? Wouldn't that be funny? And so that was an amusing log to uncover that sort of gave sort of the world building justification for why do you have a device that tells you your stats? But it seemed like some justification to put this complicated stat tracking system in there that I'm not sure did that much. Or if it did, I think its effects were kind of all under the hood and never rose to the level of perception, which is a design principle that I've sort of learned and refined through reading Emily writing about it, about how you can engineer these beautiful, interesting, complex systems, but if none of the relationships are ever exposed to the player, then they may as well not exist. So I wonder if that's what happened here, or if it actually didn't have that many actual effects on outcomes. I think it's Kruger who talks about the importance of building your power and that you have to be powerful to be taken seriously. And I was like, oh, okay, well, that's a quest or that's a threshold. I'm going to have to accomplish some number of tasks that are going to raise my power in the eyes of these people until I'm powerful enough to carry out the ritual. But again, unless that happened automatically just through the way I played, I don't know if anything ever happens if you're not powerful enough or if you carry your food around and commit lots of faux pas and make everyone think you're seriously unintelligent. I don't know if there's any fail states or any thresholds for anything that you need to do. So that also felt like a in-depth system that probably took some time to implement, but felt like just weren't there at all, that I wouldn't notice anything missing.
Yeah, I didn't actually encounter that database entry, at least not that I recall. So I used the doohickey entirely as a summon Liam device. I do remember that some numbers popped up when I switched it on, but I very quickly trained myself to ignore them. But now that I know what they are, I have a theory. Emily's first big game, Galatea, had a secret dashboard that you could pull up to sort of look under the hood and see Galatea's attitude and how strong your relationship with her is and how many turns until she switches subjects and so on and so forth. So my guess is that this might be the same sort of thing, that Emily used it for debugging and then gave it an in-story justification so she wouldn't have to pull it out of the code later.
Most of the other interactions as you're collecting stuff and acquiring items and doing what you need to do, there doesn't seem to be anything that really changes. It feels pretty deterministic. So I just couldn't detect any point where there would have been a change, even if it was meant to be like a hidden system. Like, oh, well, you were too dumb, so the ambassador refused your gift or something.
Yeah, I guess my second theory would be that maybe at one point early in the game's development, stats were supposed to matter, but maybe that turned out to be an unnecessary complication. So maybe now the stats are still tracked but don't actually have any consequences. But I don't know. So, how about strengths? Anything we haven't talked about already?
I always enjoy a system that gives you a good in world database where you can just explore and learn more about the story. Games that are built around that, like Analog, A Hate Story, or Her Story, where it's all just about reading a little bit and then learning new keywords or learning new character names or learning new aspects of the world and then looking those up and learning a bit more. In games like that, that's the entire game. I don't think the system here was quite as deep and maybe not quite as progressively obscured. I felt like it was fairly easy to find most of the topics and then get a wide array of search results, and also lots of the same entries I kept getting because they contained many of the important keywords. But I think that was implemented very well, and it feels like a really essential tool to a situation where you're in an unfamiliar place, you don't know anything about it, you have to quickly figure out what everything is, and you can't do it by talking to people.
Back in the early days of the internet, I was once talking to someone who said that he hated the idea of online dictionaries because they had no serendipity. He said that when your dictionary is just a big book, when you go to look up a word, you can't help but see a bunch of other nearby words, so you absorb definitions you had not sought out, and that's great. He didn't want society to lose that avenue for random information to enter people's minds. Well, in Floatpoint, you don't actually pull up individual entries when you type in your search term. Every entry with that term comes up, and some are quite unrelated to what you might have been looking for. So you end up with these random pieces of the backstory just sort of falling into your lap. So score one for serendipity, I guess. But speaking of the backstory, I think we both noted that the backstory of Floatpoint sure seems to speak to the 2020s a lot more than it does to 2006.
Sure does. I don't know that I had much deeper to say about it other than just like I started noting down a laundry list. So there's a fictional plague, which is a big part of the backstory of Earth. And a lot of the beats of it seem to rhyme with what would actually happen a number of years later. Apparently, it was devastating to the global south. Africa is now apparently empty and being reforested and ripe for the return of wayward colonists. I did have some questions about that. Nobody's using Africa, really? China locked down and pursued a increasingly isolationist trajectory. North America is distributing vaccines, and there's some mention of some controversy that got hushed up. There was a major American city, Chicago in this case, rather than New York, that was an early hotspot with all of these deaths and huge consequences. New Zealand quarantined, escaped some of the worst. The player character, his backstory is he went to, it's called an ARC, which is basically just this like very expensive sealed community where they basically locked everyone in and protected themselves from the outside world with lots of money. At some point, someone makes the case that, like, hey, that's pretty much just what China did, only on like a smaller scale. And he's like, yeah, well, maybe. I don't know. I guess I'm glad that that happened to me. But yeah, it's strikingly prescient, I suppose. I guess it reveals a certain understanding of geopolitics and how these sorts of things might go in the event of a major worldwide devastating plague like the one that actually happened. Very resonant, I think.
Yeah, I was particularly struck by the role of New Zealand as a haven. given how in real life that seemed to be the one country that was at zero COVID for quite a while there. And when I first played this, the phrase labor shortages jumped out at me because that was a phrase that had been all over the news at the time, however inaccurate it might have been. One point of divergence is that when the vaccines are developed in the game world, the controversy is about the vaccines being in such high demand that the distributors become too powerful. It's not about a third of the population refusing to take them.
Some things are just too strange for fiction.
Yeah, I've read quite a few works that revolve around a plague now, and vaccine skepticism wasn't a part of any of them. Certainly not to the level we saw in real life. So, Emily certainly isn't alone in perhaps putting too much stock in human nature on this count. So, we're getting near the end of our segment, and I know you wanted to discuss the game's handling of non-player characters. As noted up front, Floatpoint did win the 2006 Zizzy Award for NPCs.
I can see why, because it's not through conversation with them, but the characters in this are certainly a very big part of the story. Just learning about their stance on things, how they fit into the society, untangling the romantic triangle that was going on between the ambassadors and Liam and how that fits into things. The message correspondence, I actually really enjoyed the fact that you're able to reply to people, which I didn't necessarily expect when I tried it, but it actually turns out to be an integral part of the story. I was just very impressed by a very characterful and social story where you were, for the most part, not allowed to talk to anyone. I've always felt like I never could get the hang of NPCs in IF. I know how to go north and get lamp and open chest and put fish in ear and all that stuff. But whenever I encounter a character, I'm always like, all right, how much do they talk? How can I talk to them? And what is going to be recognized syntax? And I always stumble over things like greet man or say hello to man or ask man about the weather or whatever. I always seem to struggle with it. So it was, I guess, kind of a blessing and a relief that you're not expected and not able to really talk to anyone. I like how you don't know what you're doing, you don't speak the language, you don't understand anything, and you just can't talk to people, so don't even try. It says specifically, like, just use gestures. I did a lot of bowing, which increases your sociability if you ever have a reason to want your sociability stat to go up.
I'm sure I could benefit from upping my sociability stats out in the real world. Maybe I should try that bowing thing. So, I guess we can wrap up with an overall assessment. I'd say that Floatpoint is, for the most part, a well-programmed game. I found a couple of glitches, like at one point the game assumed that I knew about a jacket before I actually learned about it. And also there was a bit where a scenery description repeated itself like 6 times in a row.
Oh, with the scientist?
Yeah.
Yeah, I got that too. And then it said, oh, it's stuck. And then I could just continue entering prompts and I was able to keep playing. So I was actually kind of impressed by the robustness of being able to play after what looked like it might have been an interminable loop otherwise.
I guess Liam would argue that this just goes to show that if the game itself can survive a fail state, maybe Aelhart can too. As for Floatpoint purely as a piece of writing, I'd say it's certainly very strong, but there's something about the narrative voice that doesn't quite work for me. It's hard for me to put my finger on. I guess maybe I'd put it this way. The game is called Floatpoint because, just like the colonists are disgusted by food, they also find physical contact abhorrent. You mentioned the bowing, which is big on Aelhart because they don't do handshakes. And they don't even like physical contact with the floor. So they have these little devices, float points, that let them float above it. And again, maybe I missed something, but I think this was just extra. Detail for the sake of detail, which is great. But I think the standoffishness of the Aelhart colonists also comes through in the writing somehow. Again, it's very good. There's even a sense of humor to it that added a lot to my enjoyment of the game. And there are some killer phrases in this game. Like, very early on, you're told that the planet has a pale ring system around it, and when you look at the rings in the sky, they're described as the skeleton of a rainbow. And that is top notch. That's the sort of thing you might find in a sci-fi novel by Martin Amis. But I don't know, I just felt like the narrative voice in Floatpoint holds the reader at arm's length somehow.
For me, it's always just a treat to be reading a writer that I know I can trust to be not just solid, but really good. It's, of course, the quality of game writing and thinking of, games and narrative games more broadly than just IF. Sometimes you're just gritting your teeth through some fairly stock and amateurish prose that I also kind of want to whip out a pen and edit at times. And it's nice to enter into a space where you sort of know you're in good hands and that it's going to be well crafted and thoughtful and well put together. And one line that stuck out that I only tried in my second playthrough because I had novice mode on, and it suggested all the verbs that you can do with various people and things. And since I noted that kiss was a verb, I decided to try and kiss Valenti on meeting him. And the response was, "You don't think he would enjoy that, and you're sure you wouldn't."
Yeah, I mean, I guess I should make it clear. It says something that when I talk about the writing in Floatpoint, the comparisons that come to mind are not other comp games I've played, or even the writing in professional games like the old LucasArts adventures or whatever. Instead, I go to published authors like Ursula K. Le Guin and Martin Amis. And if it's not entirely there yet, the fact that it is that class of thing is a recommendation in and of itself. So I think I'm out of stuff. My summary is that I'm only up to 2006, but this is one of the best pieces of IF I have played. It is pretty small, and I've mentioned a few things that didn't work for me 100%, but ultimately, these are quibbles. There are not many pieces of IF from the 70s up to 2006 that are of this quality.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you pointed me to this because I hadn't heard of it and likely would not have found my way to it otherwise. But I enjoyed it a lot. It hits a lot of the things that I'm interested in. Games with interesting ethical choices, science fiction settings with far future human colonization and interesting alien cultures and civilization. Finding yourself in a new, strange place and just exploring and learning what these people are all about. It was also, I would say, the perfect length. At the beginning, when I saw the task list and like the things I had to get, and some of the cues were leading me to expect a somewhat longer and more involved game, but it actually turned out to be pretty short and self-contained, which I certainly appreciate these days when, I don't want to be banging my head over this tightly knotted puzzle that's going to take me weeks and weeks of pacing around and banging my head against the wall. So I thought it was short and sweet and breezy and very well written, and I enjoyed it very much.
So I've tried to keep these shows between 50 and 60 minutes, and this is minute 49. So rather than bring on another guest, I thought I'd conclude this installment with a few remarks about a couple of games from 2006 that were actually not highly acclaimed, but which I was really looking forward to. So as I noted in the Floatpoint segment, prior to starting this show, the last batch of interactive fiction games I had played were the annual competition entries for 2001. Coming in second place that year was a game called Moments Out of Time by L. Ross Rzuski. The first time I saw his name, I thought it was Reshevsky, but he once told me on IFMUD that someone in his family tree had changed it to fit the pronunciation that 99% of Americans came up with when they tried to read it. I gave Moments Out of Time my top score that year. And in fact, if you had asked me after that what my favorite piece of IF was, most days, Moments Out of Time might well have been my answer. I wrote a review of it for my calendar page, which you can still find if you swing by my website and go to the calendar archives. In Moments Out of Time, you play a time traveler from around the year 2500 who goes back to the mid-21st century to explore a regular suburban house in the hours before a nuclear war. What I liked about the game was its sheer depth of content. This is a game that has dossiers on a bunch of alien species we never encounter, and it presents the entirety of a teenage girl's diary, as we see how a bunch of regular lives are distorted by the imminent end of the world. First slightly, and then suddenly a whole lot. So in 2006, Ross released 2 sequels, within a few days of each other, apparently. The original Moments Out of Time had a weird tag calling it Explorer Type. And now here we had Renegade Type and Adventure Type. Now, the original game was confusing enough. I did find it hard to get my bearings, but the payoff turned out to be worth it. But with Renegade Type, you're visiting the same location, so there's not much new to discover, but you're doing so as a different character with a different agenda. The problem is that the game doesn't tell you what that agenda is. Like, that seems to be the big puzzle of the game, figuring out what you're supposed to be doing. And it's a complete artifice, because it's not like Quantum Leap, where the main character isn't sure what his mission is either, and we learn it along with him. In Renegade Type, the character knows what his goal is, but the game itself is cryptic about it for seemingly no reason other than just to add difficulty. And there isn't even any real feedback to tell you whether you're on the right track figuring it out or not, or to nudge you toward the right track if you are on the wrong one. Like, I thought I'd made a breakthrough when I found the AI sidekick, thinking that it would fill in the gaps for me, but no, not so much. I poked around for ages, and the AI gave me comments, but no real hints, so eventually, I just had to give up. I had no idea what I was doing. I did try moving on to the 3rd game in the series, though, and it did fill in the gaps a bit. Apparently, the idea is that in the original game, as you were exploring the house, you found some anachronisms, which I completely did not remember because it had been years since I'd played the original. Like, even if I had played these sequels when they came out, I wouldn't have remembered those details between 2001 and 2006. But in any case, I guess that in Renegade Type, you're creating the anachronisms, and you just have to remember what they were, I think. And then in Adventure Type, you're playing yet a 3rd character trying to set things right. Now, here I ran into a different problem. The original Moments Out of Time used the obscure Z6 format that allowed for more special effects than the Z5 and Z8 formats that were much more common at the time. Renegade Type and Adventure Type use a system called GLULKs. Renegade Type takes advantage of this format to experiment with the interface, chiefly in separating the input prompt from the output window, and that turns out to be very annoying. I kept having to click on the angle bracket to get the prompt frame to accept my input, and then every single time the output window would respond with a more prompt, even if the result was only like a line or two. Adventure Type tries to take this experimentation with interface to the next level with graphics, but the graphics are pretty sketchy. I mean, that's one of the cool things about interactive fiction. As a lone hobbyist, you can write a game that looks exactly like an Infocom game, which is kind of a thrill if you played those Infocom games as a kid. But adding graphics makes it astronomically more likely that your game will look unprofessional. And then this interface turned out to be hellaciously buggy. Like, in this series, you have a time machine that you can plug chips into to give you various special abilities. And in Adventure Type, you're supposed to be able to select 5 chips to actually see in a graphical panel over on the side. And every time I tried to use this, I got a fatal error that crashed the entire game engine, and I lost all my progress. Then when I tried switching off the fancy interface, that didn't work either, because the game text alone didn't even give me enough information for me to be able to get out of the room I was in. So I gave up on Adventure Type too. Though, to be honest, while that was mostly a disappointment, it was also partly a relief, because at the time the game started going crashy on me, I was apparently in the middle of one of those puzzles that Jess and I were talking about in the Floatpoint segment. Repair this circuitry panel. No thanks. I mean, in 1981, probably a significant share of the small audience for computer games actually did consist of electrical engineers. But 25 years later, if I start up a game that promises time travel and adventure, I don't want to spend my playing time messing with a breaker box. Seriously, if my day involves opening the breaker box at my house, that means I'm having a bad day. It's not what I would call entertainment. So I still recommend the original Moments Out of Time, and I think these sequels could have been a fun way to keep exploring this universe. But they needed a serious rethink. You gotta be player-friendly, and you gotta debug. And that wraps it up for Ask Tell number 13. Thanks to my guest, Jess Haskins, and to the authors of the games, Emily Short and Ross Rzuski. And thank you for listening. I think the next installment should wrap up 2006, and then going forward, we'll have a leaner lineup of games for each year. But we'll see, there's no telling what the future has in store. I just hope we don't all crash before we get there. Bye for now.